welcome to the Aspire Europe Limited Business Change Management series of videos. In this one, we're going to think about organisational change and the impact of culture and systems. I'm Rod Sowden, that's me over there on the right, and I'll be taking you through this. I'm the Managing Director of Aspire Europe, and I founded them in 2004, and I'm also the lead author for Managing Successful Programmes and P3M3. Culture and values are very important to me as a founder of an organisation, so I'm looking forward to sharing some of the thoughts with you during this video. But we've got quite an interesting quote to start with, because once we start meddling with culture, we start meddling with the reason the organisation exists. Change should not change tradition. Okay, so what that actually means is the foundations on which our organisation is built should still exist. You could argue that if the justification for the organisation to exist has gone, then you have to question why the organisation itself exists. So I love that quote. It's really worth taking on board what Prince Philip was saying at the time. The challenge, of course, is to maintain tradition in a fast-moving world, and that is really linked to values and culture. Okay, so what we're going to have a look at in this slide is the layers of culture that we have to deal with. So at the top level, what we call level one, the surface, or this is work by Tromperneurs and Hampton Turner a few years ago, is the visible artifacts and products. Do we all walk around in suits? Do we drive company cars? Do we value the planet and all come to work in bicycles? Does the organisation provide us with parking for bicycles but not for cars? These are the visible artifacts and products of the organisation that the world can see. How does our website look? Is it fun, or is it kind of serious and kind of heavy duty? So these are the things that the world sees, and when we're designing our communications, we want to transmit those values to customers and stakeholders who may be watching us. So those are top level surface. We then move into layer two, which is deeper, about norms and values. Now, lots of organisations are spending a lot of time talking about norms, values, and we quite often have it covered when they talk about behaviours. What do we expect of our people? Values, what's our decision-making principles? Do we think about, for example, our carbon footprint when we're making a decision, or are we thinking about our costs? Which are the dominant factors that sit below the surface of all this stuff that's around us? And then we move into the deeper one, the deepest one being basic assumptions. These are the things around why does the organisation actually exist? Now, in the case of Aspire, we were set around in 2004 to bring programme management to the world. We really, as a core of everything we do, that's why we existed, to improve organisations' performance. There will be other organisations that exist to make money. We can look at banks, those kind of organisations. They moved from basically being kind of an altruistic part of our economy to being profit-driven through insurance. Those kind of things. We've worked with organisations, for example, in the music industry. The basic assumption is they're all part of a bigger picture in that industry. Then they come obviously there to make money, but it's really a lot about musicians and technical content. Those are norms and values that lead you to recruit staff. And ultimately, if you go and work in one of these kind of organisations that are part of that infrastructure, you quite often find everybody walking around in jeans and that kind of thing. So when we start to change our culture, we need to think about how deep we go, because we could get rid of all the company cars, but what's that saying about our basic assumptions and our decision-making models? So then let's have a little think about how culture is shaped. So how do we establish what we need from people? What is the structure around us? What are the behaviours we want? And what are the symbols and the kind of things that will tell us our culture exists? So First thing we need to think about is what is our culture? Yeah, what are those things? So when you're listening to this, look around that building you're in. We've worked in the transport sector. If we work in somewhere like Network Rail, as you walk down the corridor, you'll see lots of pictures of trains, right? If we work in the BBC, you see lots of pictures of broadcasters and moments where famous moments from TV. When we worked in the music industry, as we walked around those organisations, you quite often have pictures of artists on the wall. So we see it all around us. And what those are basically symbols of the organisation that tells us what they value, what's important to them. Although I don't suppose if you walk around in a bank, you'll see lots of pictures of safes and piles of cash. But you know what's important in a bank, it's probably about security, reliability, trust, those kind of symbols that should make the customers feel more comfortable. Then we've got to think about the behaviours of our staff. Do they work to values? What is it that we expect from them? Do we accept them to challenge cultural change, or do we just expect them to accept it? These are the things that we need to work really hard when we're thinking about a change program to get behaviours to change. Because if you don't change behaviours, you won't achieve anything, basically. Then we've got the systems, the working practices. Now, how many of those change programs that we get involved in start with thinking about the working practices, and we don't think about the behaviors and symbols? So we define a new way of working, you know, the way we handle calls, but do we still want that passionate customer service still to be there, even though you've given them an awkward system to use? Do we expect those symbols to remain the same, that we feel that we're an agile organisation, but we're becoming more process orientated? These are complex areas that we need to think about when we're designing that new organisational culture. So we need to think about the systems and processes. Do we value innovation, or do we value people who stick to the process? And I'm sure when you think about some organisations you buy services off or you work with, what do you think of those when you deal with them? How do you value them? And what do you think is important to them? So when we're thinking about our culture, Caroline Taylor came up with these 5 organisation types. And really what you want to be able to do is work on the one that's most appropriate for you. But we need to remember that most organisations have a blend of these things. They're not one or the other. So when we're thinking about an organisation, what do we see as success? Working in an organisation that's not successful, yeah, is not very motivated. It's like playing for a football team that's bottom of the league. You know, inevitably, whatever they say, your motivation will dry up if you're being continually criticised or battered, or you lose money every year. So what is success looking like? So if you work in a charity, it's not about making money, it's about effective results in the environment you're working in. Then we got to think about customer centric. Well, okay, so that could be any organization, because every organization has customers. Service orientation, or are you going to be product orientated? Yeah, you can think of organizations that we associate with a high value product, something like Dyson, for example. We don't think of them as service orientated, but I'm sure they are. But you think about somebody like Virgin, who we think about them, you know, they are very customer centric, or that's the image they like to create. Maybe if you've used their services, you might find them different. But those are the kind of things that we need to think about. So they're externally focused. One of the most important things in an organization is this kind of one team, one organization. If you haven't got that, then different cultures build up in different parts of the organization. And this is a major issue. When you're thinking about delivering a big organizational change, you'll quite often find the operations team may have one kind of priority or culture or set of behaviors that is different to, say, the program and project management team, or the marketing team will see things. So you get these internal clashes of cultures that when you do an organizational wide change, you need to bear in mind. because one set of communications, one set of changes will have different effects in different parts of the organization. Innovation, how much do we value innovation? You know, we hear the word agile everywhere at the moment. We want to be agile. What does it actually mean? It means we want to be customer centric. In most cases, it just means we want to survive. But that creativity and entrepreneurship are really important in some organizations. But if you're working in an industry which is heavily process orientated, or is heavily involved with sort of care and life support, you know, in certain areas of the NHS, you don't want them to be too agile and creative, because there are ways of dealing with procedures on certain health issues. So innovative is like a fun thing, agile, all that, but it's not right for some organisations. Now, putting people first, how important is that to us? And is it our people? I'm conscious, just as I'm talking about this, of a big change program in one of our clients where all the focus has been about passengers and what it does and doing it better, but it's quite clearly coming through. They haven't thought about their internal people and the impact to those people, and you can see them becoming disillusioned after 18 months of this big change program. So having people at the forefront of change is essential, but it's easier to put it at the back, and that's why change quite often doesn't work. So, um, Senge and colleagues back in '99 used the metaphor of plant growth to help understand why it's so complex to implement a change and then sustain it, because there are ecosystems in organizations, soft networks of people who work together and then spread around, that actually sustain organizations. And when you start to challenge those networks, they will resist, and they will fight back if you don't understand the change you're doing. Now, invariably, when organizations bring a lot of consultancies in to help with the change, they will not understand this ecosystem. And as I mentioned earlier, I was the lead author for Managing Successful Programs. And we built into that model the concept of the business change manager and their infrastructure. And that was really to ensure that big change programs had engagement with the business and they understood what was going on, if you like, at the customer edge. So if the customers were changing, then we were able to build that back into the way we were running the program, so that we remained aligned with what was needed. And the organism and the symbolic cycle from Senge helps us kind of think about things. You know, the organization gets fed. Obviously, it gets income from money, but it gets acknowledgement from the press. I can think about some organizations that get continual negative press. If you think about someone like Network Rail, for example, or maybe some of the other transport organizations in the UK, TfL and maybe Highways, they only really hit the press when something goes wrong. But even though they are continually successful in what they do 99% of the time, it's only the 1% that becomes public knowledge. And so therefore, in those organizations, people are very resilient. If we think about adult social care, those people are driven by things other than reward, because, you know, to a large extent, their pay is pretty poor, but they clearly get rewards in themselves from helping elderly and people who are less well off. So we need to see that ecosystem. And when you start making changes based on the wrong premise, it will, well, not only will the change not happen, you can end up having a reverse effect with people leaving, and the organization failing for other reasons. So finally, we just want to look at Senji's view of change and actually how we get it moving. So it's important to remember that if we do nothing, or if we do a poor change model, then we'll have a blip. There's a whole new surge of energy around we're going to be different, but then the whole thing goes back to where it was, and the organisation will resist change. So there are three steps in this process identified by these guys. first of all, we need to initiate the change. And a lot of this is around effective communication of the vision. And very importantly, it's where the leaders of the organization start to rethink their behaviors and they start to, as we say, walk the talk at this point, and how they address staff. It's so common to see organizations talking about change, but the leaders see the change being something everybody else does because they're going to stay the same way. Now, in that kind of initiation, then people won't really buy into it and it will just be a blip, maybe some money wasted. So things we need to think about at that point, making sure people have enough time to learn what's needed of them, finding that they have the coaches and support to help them through it, and understand their relevance in the change program that's coming. Then we need to start sustaining it, which is really about creating momentum. Yeah, if people need to lose their anxiety about the job. When people go through change, they'll always worry about their job. So if we can remove those anxieties, then it helps to sustain it. Of course, the other side of it is if you want to move what is a deeply frozen organization, using the terms from Lewin about unfreezing, maybe you do need to make them anxious in the initiating stage, make them feel uncomfortable so they know it has to change. Because it's all very well saying we need to remove that anxiety, but then that anxiety can be an energy for change as well. Okay, maybe we pilot things. You have some groups piloting the new ways of working, but again, you need to be careful that you don't create a culture or a cult of people who believe in the change whilst everybody stood back kind of waving at them saying good luck with that one. So there are different ways, but really you need to have groups, and those groups need to be believers, and they need to disseminate the good news and the evidence that the change can happen around the organization. And then we need the continual improvement, which is the redesign and the rethinking. This is where agility is coming in. Once we've got this thing going and we've got some momentum, the agile approach with new ideas, we need to take that on board. We don't want to be too set in our thinking about where we're going to go. If we're agile, we need to change to the market and come up with new ideas and change. And in this case, the external market, we've also got to remember that the internal staff are a market for our change program. Okay, so that's basically the Senge view of life and the 3 challenges that we're going to face. Okay, well, we've come to the end of the video. I hope you found that useful. I hope you go on to be very successful in the course and maybe watch some other videos in the near future. Time for you to go and enjoy a cup of coffee and think about the implications of what I've been saying.